to procedural systems for production in Cinema 4D. My name is Zachary Corzine. I am a motion designer and 3D generalist currently at Man vs. Machine in Los Angeles. I am a multidisciplinary designer, so oftentimes I am taking an all-inclusive approach to my work, and that means covering the entire pipeline, both from initial concepting, initial look development, all the way through to style frames, animation, and final production. And that is the way that I designed this course. So it is a comprehensive walkthrough of my approach to designing and developing different procedural systems that we can then use in conceptually driven commercial work. And by taking a sample client brief, we can distill that brief down into parts that we can address. And from there, we'll begin concepting and applying different forms of design thinking to develop a procedural design language. Throughout this course and throughout the process, we'll be covering best practices for creating scalable systems that are production ready, and we will span an entire workflow from look development and R&D to then texturing and finishing a shot. And the tools we'll be using for this course are primarily Cinema 4D R20. Besides our render engine and some Grayscale Gorilla products, I really wanted to stick to the base program because ultimately this course is about conceptual thinking and procedural approach that can be implemented in any workflow. And I think just kind of sticking to the base R20 program gives us a nice foundation to build upon and a good basis to begin shifting our approach and our thinking in that direction. So what is working procedural? A lot of this is just a fancy way of saying that it is utilizing a procedure or a set of rules that's organized in a hierarchy. So each object or each node in the hierarchy can dynamically update based on changes up the chain. So ultimately, we are minimizing user input and creating a lighter scene by instead making a rule set that can be applied towards the objects or nodes down the chain. Meaning that once we develop the system, we can change a minor set of parameters to generate entirely new outputs. Unfortunately, Cinema 4D isn't a node-based system and it isn't entirely structured for proceduralism, but there are a variety of techniques that I use when I am working within Cinema 4D that can help make it as procedural as possible. And really just shifting your thinking and shifting your approach towards proceduralism is beneficial in all regards because this can be applied towards shader networks, how much we push to the render side, and how we develop a system that can react dynamically that will streamline our workflow and make us more efficient and more effective, and ultimately allow us to address changes throughout the process or respond to client feedback and generate a wide variety of looks and a systematic approach that wouldn't otherwise be possible without implementing some procedural techniques. Now let's take a look at the brief. And a lot of times I will take the initial client brief that I receive and reformat it into something more digestible, especially if I am going to be conveying this information to a team. It helps a lot to take this time to really digest the information and lay it out in a format that I can move forward with. So in this case, the client is a high-end luxury cushion manufacturer, and they are looking to develop a series of different designs for a new line of products that they're rolling out. And they make cutting-edge cushions that are utilized in a variety of applications, including mattresses, upholstery, and furniture. And we are tasked with envisioning both the overall design direction of the product line, as well as how they represent the product benefits and the features. So because this is a conceptually driven project, we are looking to convey the underlying feeling of the product, and we don't necessarily have to adhere to the exact nature of it itself. So we are free to explore how we distill down the look and feel and how we elevate the product and come up with a conceptual approach that we can use throughout the campaign. From there, oftentimes I will begin to kind of distill everything down into core concepts to convey and core benefits that the client is looking for us to integrate into our work. Some of those include a unique and fresh approach to the market that they currently exist within. They want it to feel high-end and luxurious without feeling exclusionary or elitist, so it should really feel, open and welcoming to everyone across the board. They really want to convey the unparalleled comfort and support of the product, and we should really be primarily, celebrating the product as much as possible. In terms of the look, they're interested in hyperrealism, and it should feel refined and detailed. And some of that has to do with the fact that we should utilize some layering of materials and patterns in both the cushioning and the threading. And in terms of motion, they had mentioned that they are looking for it to feel, very intriguing and mesmerizing. And it should feel systematic and interconnected, as if all the different aspects of the design are responsive to one another and are all part of an overlying system. Now that we have a sense of the brief, I quickly want to dive into course structure just to give an idea of the 4 lessons that we'll be walking through. Here is the 4 lessons that the course will consist of, and as the iconography suggests, it really is about building a foundation that we can elaborate on further throughout the process, both in terms of the procedural systems that we'll be developing and also the design systems and the design language and the overall concept development. So the first lesson is the one that we are taking place in right now, and this will be an overview and top-level look at the entire process. So we'll be taking the brief, distilling that brief down into actionable points that are more addressable, and then beginning to do some mind mapping, pulling reference, sketches, as well as beginning to concept, design, and execute a specific shot as well as various style frames for the project. So it'll give a good understanding of how I structure my personal process and the overall project as a whole. Lesson 2 will be focused on base systems and approach, and I'll really be focused on giving a foundational understanding of procedural systems within Cinema 4D and a variety of different techniques, including how to instance geometry to affect a variety of different setups. We'll be creating a lot of different setups just to get an idea of different effects and different techniques that we can utilize when developing further down the line. We'll be using fields to drive different changes and understanding how we can dynamically affect different polygon selections, shader changes, deformers, etc., all using fields. We'll take advantage of a lot of the upfront research and development that we have done to create a lot of different unique setups that we can implement later on in our design phase. We'll get a good understanding, and I'll reiterate this again and again because it's a really important point, of smart parent-child relationships and the importance of the hierarchy within our scene. And you can really utilize this to your own advantage and get a lot of benefits of using this approach when working within Cinema 4D. Lesson 3 will be layering upon those base systems. So we'll begin the design phase and start to develop the design language and the system that we'll use for our different various forms of foam and cushions and stitching, and begin to understand how those can interconnect and relate to one another. We'll begin our look development and exploring various different style frames. We'll begin building upon our design language and start to concept a specific shot. And then we'll look at some techniques for creating subsystems and a procedural set of relationships. So how those individual systems and those individual setups can begin to respond to one another and really have dynamic feedback up and down the chain. The final lesson will be finesse and finishing, and we'll continue with the development of our motion tests and begin to build out additional subsystems that we'll need for the padding layers and the stitching that we'll incorporate. We'll talk about approach to look development, some texturing and lighting, and then we'll finalize the shot with micro details and some final touches. And then we'll close out with final thoughts and philosophies. So now that we have an understanding of the course as a whole, let's jump into addressing the brief and begin distilling that down to move forward along the process. So we have gotten the brief from the client. We kind of have our main concepts that we are looking to address. And from there, a lot of times I will distill this down into our main objective, just for ourselves to kind of make sure that we have all our ducks in a row right before we start the project and we know the core elements of what our objective is. So here I've kind of distilled it down into conceptualizing a look and feel to capture the product benefits that we've listed. We should provide the client a design language and procedural system that they can use to kind of expand out upon a range of work. And in the end, it should elevate and establish the core features of the product through a unique approach that really stands out and differentiates itself from other competitors within the same market. So from there, we can begin doing a variety of techniques, one of those being mind mapping. And so here I've kind of taken the core element, which is high-end cushioning, and begin to blow those out into different buckets. And we have kind of our look and feel, we have our tone, and we have reference that we can begin using. And you can kind of format this however you like. I tend to break these out into these larger buckets first, and then from there kind of splinter out. But this gives me a kind of good sense of where the territory lies. And from there, once we have this kind of general mind map, and from there, oftentimes I'll begin pulling reference. And reference is basically our first kind of major step in establishing a design direction. Before we actually sit down and start developing our own frames and exploring different looks, it's a way for us to explore what direction we are headed in. And we can really take advantage of this step in the process by laying as much groundwork as possible so that these different reference boards can then serve as guideposts as we move forward in the process. And oftentimes when you're working on a specific frame, you'll be head down, very focused on what you're trying to accomplish with a specific technique or a specific look. And sometimes you can kind of lose a sense of what you were looking to achieve in the first place. And so these can serve as a kind of guiding light through those moments and give you a strong kind of foundation to always return back to and to build from. When starting to find reference, I think it's very important to stay open with where to draw from and try to find as many different realms to pull from as possible. And then as we kind of begin gathering reference, we'll get an idea of what is working, what isn't, and then we can begin establishing a clear direction as we curate our boards down. Once we have a sense of all our different boards and we begin refining them and iterating on them, we want them to be as clear and concise as possible. Each image should really serve a purpose. We should be very hypercritical of our boards because it is, again, our guidepost as we move forward. So allow it to be your master set of reference, and so don't let anything in there that doesn't need to be. In terms of pulling reference and inspiration, try to find a variety of places and a range of fields really outside of design and 3D. I think that really helps with developing a more unique voice and unique vision is kind of pulling from adjacent fields or different industries entirely, from nature, whatever you can. And for this project, I gathered reference from textile manufacturing, different vehicle upholstery, fashion design, 3D printing, and you won't see any 3D design reference within the boards because we're really looking to achieve something that is unique to the market that we're in, unique to the type of product we're representing, and isn't necessarily something that should be 3D designed. So really stay open in terms of pulling from new places and finding inspiration from places outside of the field that you may think it belongs in. All right, so diving into the boards here, we're basically pulling the core concepts that I have taken from the brief and from our mind mapping and creating a series of boards from there. So the first board that I have here is in reference to the feeling and the type of feeling that we are trying to invoke through the project. So oftentimes this can serve as a very good first touch basis with the client as well to make sure you guys are all on the same page when moving forward with the process. So here I have kind of pulled images that help invoke the feeling we are looking to represent. And I've done a brief write-up of what that feeling is. So we are tasked with conveying this exceptional support and comfort of the cushioning. And these different elements kind of help illustrate the pleasurable sensation of being enveloped by this delicate and spring-back foam. You should get a sense of warmth, of softness, of pliability. And these images help give a sense of the feeling that we are trying to represent here. The next board that I put together was in terms of the cushioning itself. So I've pulled inspiration from, different grids of cushioning and different patterns that are kind of stitched upholstery that hold the cushioning in, as well as free form foam, as on the image to the right here. So these provide a good basis that we can use to how we can represent the cushioning within our work. When I was doing research, modern cushioning really relies on different experimental manufacturing processes and a lot of 3D printing, which again allows us to draw from more uncommon aesthetics that you wouldn't see a lot of times in the market that we're in. So next board here that I put together was in reference to the patterns that we can begin to utilize in our work. And I was very inspired by different varying densities of patterns. So you can see some of these are kind of finer threading that then begin creating kind of micro patterns, as well as larger structures of patterns. And I think a really nice quality are how these different geometric patterns still have some organic qualities to them. So you'll see that you can tell that they have a manufactured quality to them, and the process of manufacturing really shows through. So it makes it feel more intentional and designed, while also remaining to be tactile and tangible. The next board that I have created here is in reference to the layering that we want to use throughout the project. So layering of both different materials, different qualities of materials, as well as colors to be able to show depth and refinement. I see the layering here really as how we begin to understand how the patterns relate to each other and how different varying textures are able to sit against one another, and the way that the layering begins to reveal itself are all kind of different things that can be drawn upon when we are developing both our color palettes as well as our material palette and the different forms that we're invoking. So the layering is kind of a mechanism that we can use when we begin to understand how these different elements can sit well amongst one another. Next board I put together here is just how to represent the luxury, the high-end aspect. And so you can see it's pulling from different sophisticated materials, really minimalist color palettes, and the refined nature of a lot of these images. We can find inspiration in a lot of peripheral fields. So it's like pulling from both the design of the objects themselves as well as how they are represented and how they're photographed. A lot of shallow depth of field, very stripped back color palettes, all kind of invoke a sense of luxury and a sense of high end. So those are our master boards that we will be using throughout the project and that we can refer back to. From there, now that we have an initial design direction through our reference boards, we can begin doing some thumbnail sketches to really quickly explore different compositions and some of the essential qualities that we want to represent in our designs. Sketches really can cut to the core of the underlying elements, and at this point in the process be a much more efficient use of our time just to get a sense of just the overall project as well as specific compositions, rather than trying to just dive straight into the computer and generate stuff straight from the gate. With thumbnail sketches, we really shouldn't concern ourselves with like the feasibility of a sketch and don't spend too much time on a single one. It's more just kind of getting out as much as possible. And here I explored just a handful of sketches, but it really is the more time you have to explore, the more primed you will be moving forward in the process. So here are some of the sketches that I generated, and you can see it's begin to kind of pull some of the patterns, some of the compositions that I was inspired by, as well as some of the qualities that I want to represent. You can get a sense of different kind of varying materials, and this is just an initial dive into what I'm thinking in terms of composition. And we might not move forward with any of these specifically, but it really helps in the process to, again, give us a nice groundwork to build on, give us a sense of what we're moving forward towards, what's working and what isn't. Next, I'd like to discuss building a design language. And this is actually something that we will touch on more specifically in terms of process. But at this point, it's a look at how I would begin trying to develop a system that we can use. So rather than just generating a single frame, it is developing an inner connected, a systematic approach to a design language that can be utilized across the project. So for this specific aspect of the design language, it is in terms of the foam and the cushions. So this is my first step in creating a design language and beginning to develop different systems that we can then implement and expand and iterate upon. So in the first frame here on the far left, you can see I'm beginning to kind of explore how the different individual cushions can then come together to create different forms. And from there, basically taking that same procedural system and iterating upon it to see how those can layer upon each other and begin to generate, interlocking forms and bigger cushioning systems that we can utilize. From here, I begin exploring base forms. So it's kind of like playing with our primary color palette in a sense. And again, it's very loose at this point. We're not sure what we will move forward with, what feels successful, keeping it open, and really just exploring and trying to get a sense of the underlying system that we can utilize throughout the project. So I created this primary set of forms. And from there, use those same techniques, but expanded upon them to the next level of complexity. So you can see how these relate to each other in terms of how all of these base forms then begin to generate some more complex forms and can then become larger systems that we can begin to use. From those initial base forms, I then went in to start developing different style frames to get a sense of maybe how these cushions sit within an environment, or how they, again, begin to take those singular blocks and interconnect them to generate higher density sets of cushioning. And so I then begin exploring building design language for the stitching patterns that we'd use. And again, it's kind of starting with a base structure and using the procedural system to generate more complexity as it moves forward, and we can dial those back depending on our needs. So I started with exploring a pretty simple subdivided plane that we can generate different stitching patterns from, and iterated on that further to generate more complexity, to get a sense of, how the design language can relate to itself. And then from there, generating even more complexity. So now we're layering some different systems. You'll see we'll have varying sense of grids, different kind of size structures that are layered onto each other. And then using that system, I begin kind of following that through line from these initial base forms, generating more complexity, then layering different variations of the system on top of each other, and from there creating different style frames. And now these aren't necessarily representing what we're looking to achieve. They're not very soft. They don't necessarily invoke the qualities that we're looking for. But again, it's just exploring the procedural systems and getting a sense of our boundaries, what is too far, what is not far enough. Where we are really within the project, and these can kind of serve just as much as what not to do or what isn't working as much as what is. From there, now that I have kind of developed these two different design languages that I can implement, I started to get into look development itself, and it's then trying to maybe get closer to what we're looking to achieve in terms of qualities that we're looking to invoke, different layering, different materials, starting to get some interesting structures that we can use for the foam, and some interesting patterns. And you can see how a lot of these pull inspiration from our initial reference boards. Throughout this, I'm going back again and again to revisit the reference boards to get a sense of what I want to achieve and what about those initial reference was working. Some more free-form foam, as well as a more structured approach. I think the structured approach is working a lot better, but these kind of free-form foam structures really did help guide along the way to develop this structured form. So they helped along in the process. And from there, just trying to get a sense of maybe different colors, different materials, how we layer those materials, and then begin to kind of integrate some of the stitching in there as well. Some more stitching patterns with some of these. I think we're getting some interesting qualities. These may be, a little bit too complex for what we're looking to represent, but you're getting a sense of we can generate all these different style frames using the same kind of base system, and how we can change a small array of parameters to generate a wide variety of outputs. And from here, I began to kind of get a sense of, okay, we have our design language in play, we have our different procedural system, let's go back to the concepts we're trying to represent. And with that, I landed on representing the supportive and comfort aspect by perhaps having this dynamic cushioning that can react to what is being impressed upon it, and contrasting maybe the fragile nature of what could sit on the cushioning with how supportive the cushionings themselves are. And that really can give us a sense of how beneficial and comfortable the cushions are. And from that, I can get a sense of what my concept was and begin to do a brief write-up of the concept itself. So what I landed on in that regard is the high-end cushioning system is dynamic and extremely reactive to changes. By contrasting the fragile nature of our center sphere with the support of the underlying cushions, we can provide a tangible understanding to the user of how beneficial and comfortable the cushions really are. From that, oftentimes, I'll take this concept write-up and then create a master direction of both the look and feel. So the look is refined and layered qualities of materials, and the feel is responsive and supportive cushioning. And from there, I began creating my final style frame and my final motion tests for the shot. Let me take a look at these here. And with these, created a handful of different colorways just to present to client different ways to represent this product line. And with these, again, it's going back to our original concepts to represent, as well as our reference boards in terms of the feeling. And that about wraps up lesson 1. And moving forward, we'll begin diving into how to create those design languages, how to create different procedural systems, and how we can utilize proceduralism as much as possible in our workflow. So I look forward to the next lesson, and thank you so much for watching. Take care.